So I wanted to start with a difficult ask. I wanted to have you think about something. I have that bag of the difficult and the messy. I want you to think about the difficult and the messy that you have experienced recently. Maybe think about something terrible that you have been through recently or at some point in your life. Think about something painful or sad or stressful. Think about something that caused you to think, even for a moment, I don't think I can make it through this. Are you thinking of something? Because what I know about what you're thinking about is you likely didn't choose the situation you found yourself in, did you? You may have had to make some decisions in the face of adversity that precipitated more pain or part of the situation, but it likely wasn't your desired path. It wasn't your first choice. Now consider these questions about whatever you're thinking about. How has this altered the way I think or see the world or understand myself? What beautiful or good things have I found through this tragedy, through this heartache? Who have I become, or who am I becoming that I wouldn't or couldn't have any other way than through this? So we are today a bunch of losers. Frank Sinatra has a song, "Here's to the Losers." It is a song celebrating the vast community of the brokenhearted. To live here is to hurt. To live here is to suffer. To live here is to lose something. As children, from the moment we can think or feel, we've started searching for meaning. We started searching for identity. We've searched for connection. And in all those things, unfortunately, when we find them, we invariably find them in things and people and situations that are tragically and consistently temporary. And because of that, we are guaranteed to lose what we love. As we form our self-portraits in the middle of this, and we find our convictions, and we love others, and we engage the world, we are headed straight into the turbulence of change. And it's been said that the only one who likes change is a wet baby. Now, we all know that change is inevitable. It's an inherent part of this life. We understand that intellectually. We may even welcome change sometimes. We actually selectively love change when it feels pleasant or positive or beneficial. A birth or a wedding, a raise, a new house. But when change comes through loss and through injury, we are almost never prepared for it, let alone warmly welcome it. At first, that kind of change feels unnatural and wrong. We experience trauma, and no matter how prepared we think we are prior, we invariably ask the question of why. Why this person? Why my career? Why now? Why them? We try and make sense of something that seems and actually is largely senseless. And the more sudden or unexpected or jarring the circumstances, the more the question of why seems to burden us. When a partner leaves, when we lose a beloved pet, when a relative we've cared for passes away, when a 40-year career is suddenly over, we don't just face the pragmatic implications of the situation. We don't just face the practical task that we need to tend to, right? The physical stuff that needs doing, the busy work, the details. We face the existential shaking of what we believe about ourselves, about the world, about the whole system that holds it all together. That kind of change is a fully disorienting experience. And for most of us, the story of the last few years has been of grieving over the losses and the letting goes and the changed plans, right? We are losers here because of someone we've lost to death or to a political or religious divide between us. We are losers because of something we've lost, a job or a business or some part of our physical health. We're losers because we've had to leave something, a toxic relationship or some unhealthy situation. We've lost pets, or we've lost someone who we cared for long term, or we've received dire diagnoses, or we've had kids move out and find the empty nest. We're losers because we've had to give up something, the freedom to travel or a planned career. Now, they say that earthquakes are the most frightening experiences a human being can endure, because when the very ground beneath your feet becomes unstable, nothing feels safe anymore. When the bedrock begins to move, there's nowhere to run from the fear. There's no escape from that kind of shaking. Similarly, when the bedrock of your sense of security and safety starts to shift, it brings a panic that is terrifying and disorienting. Now, these tremors in our lives, they can come from a specific event, some experience of profound pain or loss or injury that causes us to question who we are in one catastrophic instant. We can see or pass through such trauma that the bottom of our sense of self seems to drop out without warning. Sometimes the journey into this earth-rattling crisis of self begins so quietly, it unfolds so subtly and gradually that we don't even realize it's happening. Some subtle changes, some quiet losses, some things that we didn't even register as grief until one day we look back and we see how much pain we've been carrying. When we experience what I call the collateral damage of being human, when we're visited by tragedy or injury and we grieve, we eventually do what is sometimes called in the world of grief, meaning making. The idea of meaning making is an attempt to reacclimate ourselves to the world post-loss in a way that gives us some sense of agency in the uncontrollable. Something that helps us reinterpret the big picture for us. Something that gives us a path forward in whatever normal will now look like. Author David Kessler writes, "Loss is simply what happens to you in life. Meaning is what you make happen." Or to use an idiom we're all familiar with, meaning making or rewriting your story is taking the lemon bitterness of loss and trying to make lemonade. When we grieve a letting go or a goodbye or a changed plan, it impacts us in a number of ways. How we see ourselves, how we view the world now and our place in it, and how we imagine the future and the possibility or the lack of it that we anticipate there. And I wonder what your losses and your pain has caused you to think about the future. Do you see opportunity, expectancy? Do you see the wide open expanse, or do you question if there is still good and beautiful and better? Part of meaning making or rewriting our story is about coping. It's an attempt to soothe the agony that we're feeling and to ground us in something stable, but in a more powerful way. It's about crafting a response to painful change that makes that change redemptive, that helps us reaffirm our identity in the face of the changes. And one question I want you to ask is, what am I learning, or what have I learned about myself in the wake of the loss that I've experienced? How have you surprised yourself? For example, if a partner has died, where have I discovered a self-sufficiency that I hadn't needed or felt in a long time? In the aftermath of a career detour, How have I been resilient and creative in finding new ways to provide for my family and for myself? Faced with the long-term care of a relative, how have I tapped into a patience and empathy I never realized I possessed? Meaning making allows us to honor our growth in a season of adversity, for us to stand and celebrate who we are, the plan B or plan C or plan Q version of ourselves. And another question we can ask when those difficult and painful times come is, what can I do tangibly now based on my post-loss experience, new insights that I've had, clarified beliefs that I can now embody? What can I do with what I know now? You might have shifted your priorities because of the tragedies you walk through. You might have changed your schedule to reflect those priorities. Your loss might have illuminated a need that you feel burdened and positioned to address by volunteering or giving financially. Maybe starting a social media support group or launching a nonprofit or a scholarship. Or it might simply have changed a mindset that has made you more aware of people's need and more intentional about reaching out to them. Perhaps empathy has the thing that has come to you in the middle of this that you didn't have before. As often we talk about here, the small, the close, the here, the now, and the doable. That is what we have. So what small, close, here, now, and doable can you live in the face of what you've lost or let go of? A decade ago, I lost myself. My father had died a few months earlier, and he was the person I was most afraid of losing in the world. And he had died, and the day after he died, I was in an interview for a job. Not a good time to be making a decision. But I got the job at this new church in Raleigh, North Carolina. So we moved here in the middle of grieving, a few months after a funeral. And I remember I have always told those of you who know me that after only a few months at that church, I heard God calling me to leave that church. Came in the form of my pastor's voice saying, "You're fired." So there I was at a Starbucks on a Thursday afternoon, strangers hearing someone tell me, "You're not wanted here. You've never fit in. You need to leave." And even though I knew it was coming, right? Even though I knew I was probably going to preach my way out of a job, it was still devastating because this wasn't just a job. This was part of who I was. This was part of my identity as pastor, caregiver, leader. I wasn't just jobless, I was Johnless, at least a massive part of me. For the first time in 17 years, I didn't have a church to call home. For the first time in 17 years, I didn't have a community to be part of. For the first time in 17 years, I was not a pastor. And it was then that I had my first experience of what they call compound grief, when the difficulties and the pain begin to pile up on you. See, they don't wait nicely until you finish one trauma. Loss comes when it comes, and so we begin to accrue the loss. So we're not just grieving what we're grieving a whole lot of other things. And at that moment, I decided I was never going to ask the question of why anymore, that it was a waste of my energy. The only question I was going to ask was, what now? Who am I and what do I still believe to be true? And I decided I would just keep writing and caring for people, and life would take care of itself. One of the greatest questions that loss of any kind calls us to re-examine is, where do I really find my sense of identity? What makes me me? Where does my self-portrait actually come from? See, when life seems to be in control, when we are between tragedies or emergencies, most of us have a general set of givens about our core identity, and we don't even think about it. We just are. We define ourselves by the work we do. Maybe you do. We define ourselves by the relationships that we're a part of. Maybe you have. We define ourselves by the abilities and skills that we have honed over time. We define ourselves by the things we build and create. And we define ourselves by our tribe, by the people we live life with, our families, our relationships, our schools, our towns, our faith communities. Sometimes we think about all these things and how they're connected to our self-worth, but most of the time that we just exist. We just exist with the identity operating systems functioning underneath until there's a break in the system and we're forced to acknowledge that something has been readjusted of our normal. Until what always was is gradually or suddenly no longer. And when we let go of these central pieces of identity to death or disagreement or difficult circumstances or happenstance, there's a second thing that we grieve. We haven't just lost the job or the person or the ability, but we've lost some of ourselves. We've lost the us that we used to know. Some piece of the way we defined ourselves has fallen away. And so it isn't just grief or bad news or financial threat or career adversity, it's an identity crisis. And so we don't just have to deal with the emotional chasm of an ending relationship or the practical needs of finding income or getting medical care or readjusting our travel schedules. We have to decide, who are we going to be now, given everything? Who are we going to be now? Professional athletes often talk about the deep depression they go into when they lose their physical abilities and they're forced into retirement. Their elemental sense of self was so tied to their position on the field that they find it incredibly difficult to discover an identity off the field. I imagine that in some way today you have lost a previous version of yourself because of one of those core markers of identity was taken or you had to give it up. The question becomes, how can we really find our identity in what is not losable? What cannot be taken by time or illness or death or injury or rejection or betrayal? What can we hold on to that cannot be taken? I think it's in slowly trying to separate ourselves from our role, from our title, from our physical conditions, from our attachments to people and to things, to try to figure out, to hold on to something that is relentless and enduring. In financial crises, people are always looking for careers that are recession-proof, that are not vulnerable to financial system collapse. And I want to suggest that we can try to find our identity in things that are loss-proof, in our personal convictions, in our moral code, in the causes we care about, in the ways that we love, and in the manner in which we treat people, and simply in the reality that we are once in history, never to be repeated creations, and we are still here now to be that. One of the hardest parts about change is often that our role changes, our status in the world. So we go from maybe being married to single, from being caregiver to no longer holding that responsibility, from being employed to unemployed. The question in even those times become, what are the positive aspects of my new status, even if I hadn't chosen it? What are the beautiful and life-affirming parts of this new version of myself? Our family, as I've shared with some of you, lost a young man named Stephen at the age of 23. Throughout his life, he was compassionate and supportive to everyone. He expressed kindness in a variety of ways to all sorts of people. He was one of those beaming lights in the world. And he got sick, and we hoped and we prayed, and he didn't get well. And in the wake of that, I remember his father texting me about the funeral, and one text, he finally just texted, "This blows." And that was all he could say. And it expressed everything. And in the wake of the loss that made no sense, later on, he and the rest of the family launched an organization called Do Better for Steve as a way of honoring their son's life and to continue to celebrate his presence and his priorities. This hasn't given them answers to the why of losing Stephen, but it has given them a path forward that they could walk into without him. Not long ago, I met a woman named Natalie Weaver, and Natalie's daughter Sophia was born with a number of health challenges, and she eventually passed away at the age of 10. And while her daughter was still here, Natalie became an advocate for families navigating the complicated healthcare system, and she founded Sophia's Voice, an organization that supports children and adults with disabilities, as well as caregivers and disability rights activists. But I don't want you to take those two examples and feel pressure to compete with them. Don't measure yourself this way. Meaning making or rewriting our stories doesn't have to be something as complicated or labor intensive as creating a fundraiser or starting a nonprofit. It can simply be about the smaller alterations, about changing the way we see people in our path, about the incremental ways we incorporate the learnings from our loss into our daily practices, about a new way of being in a world that, while isn't our first choice, can still have beauty and goodness and hope. Rainier Maria Rilke, in Letters to a Young Poet that I read from, also says this: why do you want to shut out of your life any uneasiness, any misery, any depression, since after all, you don't know what work these conditions are doing inside you? Why do you want to persecute yourself with the question of where all this is coming from and where it's going, since you know, after all, that you are in the midst of transitions and you wished for nothing so much as to change? As we look back on our lives, we often find that we don't grow very much from the easy and the pleasant and the comfortable. We usually grow from the disasters and the trials and the difficult. That's hard with the things we hold now. We can look back retrospectively, right? We can see that we were formed and remade and renewed and strengthened by all the pain that we've walked through. But for the present pain, it's really hard to figure that out. As we live here, friends, we're going to face suffering and grief, but it is here that we become the best version of ourselves. It is through this transformation that we do impact the world. So the question again is not why. There is no why to the pain that we go through. There is no why to the damage people do to other people. There is no why to the whims of time. But there is always a what now. I really despise the phrase, everything happens for a reason, because it puts the pressure on those of us in trauma and grief to try to get the needle in the haystack reason that this is supposedly happening. And when I was a religious person, we used to be trying to figure out, okay, I've got to talk to God and figure out why this has happened, why this person died, why this tragedy. I don't believe there is a satisfactory or rational reason we can grasp for some of the terrible and painful things we go through, but I do believe we can always do something in response that is incredibly meaningful. So today, and maybe in the coming days, catalog the ways you've grown or surprised yourself in the wake of what you've lost. Look at how you have or can embrace a new role, a new way of being in the world, and consider the agency that you've had and still have to craft a life that isn't the same or ideal, but can still be sweet. Unfortunately, we can't have a meaningful life and a pain-free life. It's kind of a package deal. But particularly when we think about the people we've loved who have died, I want you to think about this. You don't miss their title. You don't miss their achievements. You don't miss their careers or their abilities. You miss the part of them that transcended all of that. And no matter what you've lost, a job or a role or an ability, you are still here. Those things that you've lost were parts of you, they were expressions of you, but they were not the inherent part of you. Every other part of us is transitory and temporary. Every career ends. Every version of our families changes. Every one of our bodies is going to degrade, but who we are can and does transcend all of these changes. The best we can do is to welcome the version of ourselves that stands here and say, as honestly as we can, what now?